My name is Blake Sweeney, and I was a lighting lead at Digital Domain on Real Steel. The biggest challenges on Real Steel was a combination of the quantity of shots. We had to deliver, 600 shots in probably a little over a year. We had to render around 14 photorealistic robots, of which we only had 4 live action robots to match, so the rest had to be created from nothing. So at the beginning of Real Steel, we went through a series of render experiments. So based on the scope of work, we wanted to find which renderer was optimal for Real Steel. V-Ray has been used in Digital Domain commercials for years, but the first feature that was done with V-Ray at Digital Domain was Tron. And Tron was in the heart of production right when Real Steel was starting up, and it was full of glossy cars and shiny things, and the metals looked great and the cars looked great, and we figured that would port over well to the robots we had to make for Real Steel. At the beginning of Real Steel, there's a fight where a robot has to get into the ring and fight against a real bull, a bull with horns, and we didn't know if we could actually do an organic creature in V-Ray because we'd never tried it before. We did some digital doubles on Tron, but most of their bodies were covered with clothing, so you never really had to scrutinize the face. We eventually decided that V-Ray would be a good way to create a photorealistic bull with hair. In the end, even though the bull was one of the most complex creatures in the movie, especially in terms of modeling and displacement and deformations and rigging, the renders were probably the fastest we had in the movie because it was really just a giant sort of diffuse, mildly reflective character. One of the biggest challenges on the movie was to show the progression of damage to the robots during the course of a fight. So if you have a fight that has over 100 shots in it and the robots get hit sort of 50 or 60 times each, you have to see that progression of damage. You have to see the paint get scraped off and the pieces flying at the camera. We had to put together a number of complicated shaders based on mix maps. So we would paint mix maps to show where the damage was going to happen, and then using those mix maps, we plugged those into blend shaders to blend between when a robot made with car paint gets hit, then it might scrape off the car paint and expose the bare metal underneath. So we use the mix maps to drive that and just blend between multiple shaders in V-Ray. One of the beautiful things about V-Ray is that it does motion blur really well. If you've used some other ray tracers, they struggle a lot with motion blur, and you end up getting into a system where you have to render out motion vectors and you end up doing a 2D render and just smearing it in the comp afterwards. But V-Ray, you don't take that big a hit if you're doing motion blurred renders. In terms of Zeus, there was no Zeus ever created in real life, actually. So we had to go through a number of stages of exploratory look dev. So we'd go out into the parking lot, we'd look at cars, and the client basically said they wanted them to look like a gorgeous black luxury car. And then when you end up with a robot like that, then you come into the problem where how do you light them? Because if you need to light a car, you end up having to use tons of just giant soft boxes, and most of the boxing rings they had spotlights and other lights around. So lighting that scene was tough, and we ended up using a lot of really big, nice softbox HDR captured textures as our area lights from the top, just to make Zeus look like that nice, just beauty lit car. One thing that the client really loved to see, and that you'll notice at all boxing fights, is just the number of camera flashes that are happening. And in order to put the robots in the environment where all these camera flashes are going off, we needed a way to efficiently create the image that camera bulbs were just popping all the time on these robots. We would render a single pass that had up to 16 lights in it from multiple directions, and each one of the lights was on all the time. And each of those lights was also split out into a different frame buffer. And then after that, in compositing, they had a nuke gizmo they could use to fire any one of those individual flashes from any direction and tint it any color they wanted. Typically, volumetric lighting is a very expensive feature, but in V-Ray they actually have a cheap version of environment fog. So for all the different stadiums, they generally had spotlights that were swishing around the crowd, and they'd hit the robots. And to get those robots in there, we ended up just creating cones that would encompass a volume. And with that volume, we would just use V-Ray environment fog and light it up, and the robots got great volumetric shadows, and those passes were generally very cheap, like less than a half an hour, and we'd use one light with red, one with green, one with blue. So in a single pass, you'd end up with 3 volumetric lights with 3 volumetric shadows. Another great thing that all of us love about V-Ray is that the frame buffer system that it has. In any render, you can sort of shove anything else you want in there. So if you have a render and you decide that you want just an occlusion pass for the compositors to use, V-Ray offers extra text, and you can just slide that in as an extra frame buffer, and it adds a little more render time, but not a ton, and it doesn't have to be part of the actual final RGBA image. It's just you can put anything you want in there. So we end up outputting, point passes, so world space points. We a lot of what we used is based on world space Y depth, so that you can actually sort of fade around a character's feet in comp if you want. Yeah, it's a terrific system.